Hello and welcome to Professor M Explains. I'm excited to talk with you today about the relational context of interpersonal communication. Let's begin. Our text starts with a story, a very tragic story of James and Rebecca. To save some time here, everyone from the outside looked at this relationship and thought it was perfectly created out of a Disney movie until they learned that Rebecca had to be restrained one evening from stabbing James with a carving knife. In this story, we detect that while many people feel that communications from an outside perspective and an observational level are absolutely perfect, kind of sort of what we tend to envision when we watch couples on Instagram or TikTok, these perfect influencer couples. Not saying that their relationship would turn out like James and Rebecca's, but every day can't be roses and tooth fairy. Some days you're going to have thorns and you're going to have tacks and nails on the floor. But when we talk about the relational context of interpersonal communication, it's extremely important because we have to understand that we create our relational experiences through a series of communicative actions. Now, when we are examining these relational definitions and patterns on a different level, we're able to gain a better understanding of the processes that we can understand that are going to happen in the exchange of the communication process on an interpersonal communication level. When we look at how communication behavior sends two kinds of informational signals that we're going to learn in this chapter, we have to understand not only the content, but also the relational relationship of the message. Now, let me tell you, if someone's coming after you with a knife, run, okay? Because that's a message that you don't need to sit around and talk through, like James and Rebecca in our book and in our text. But we're going to also look at how we define our relationships through a series of relational bids and responses. And also the main part of what we are really asking for and from our relation partners. Now, as we answer these questions within the context of interaction, it also ties into how our identification of the bids and responses play into our understanding of the interaction context. Lastly, in this chapter, we're also going to look at patterns of interaction that define the power relationships of our significant others. Let's begin talking about message levels. Now, the overview of this chapter, we're going to talk about message levels, relational bids, relational responses to relational bids, and interaction context. Let's begin. When we talk about message levels, there are two message levels we want to understand. But first, let's define or get an understanding of what a message level is. Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist, originated the idea of message levels. While he was observing monkeys at the San Francisco Zoo, he noticed a group of monkeys fighting. After examination, he realized that they appear to be fighting, which he labeled as the content level, but they were actually playing together, which he connected to and defined it as a relational level. In fact, what he found was that the monkeys were sending each other relational messages that the fighting was to be interpreted as play. An example of this that we may see in our homes is if we have one or two dogs or we have one or two animals and they are fighting. Now, sometimes they really are fighting, and you have to understand the level of communication between your pets. But a lot of times, their fighting can be interpreted as play. This is according to research. But of course, on another level, they now have talk buttons for animals. And if you follow What About Bunny on Instagram, you can see the progression of this little cute dog named Bunny who is learning to communicate through the pressing of buttons. So while we talk about Bateson's observation of monkeys, whether they're fighting or playing, we are moving towards a communication level in technology where animals can communicate through the pressing of buttons that give out words and that expresses words. And in fact, I will show a video of this and share it in class because it's a great tie-in between Alone Together, our contextual information that we're learning from that book with our group presentations, as well as this text here in terms of how technology is opening up not only the interpersonal communication channels of humans, but also animals, which is really exciting. Let's get back and talk about the messaging levels here. The content level, as discussed by Bateson, gives content or basic data of the message. An example that we see in the text is when someone is expressing their name, instead of saying, my name is Professor M, I could say within a content level, they call me Professor M. Now that message level and that content level lets people know who are familiar with that terminology that I am expressing my introduction to you as Professor M. Now, when we talk about the relational level, that's also called the command level. And what that does is conveys information about how the speaker sees the relationship with the person to whom the message is directed. Now, an example of this, we have to use the example in the book, which is super awesome because it references a movie in which a Philadelphia police officer sent to the Deep South to work on a case walks into a situation where he's faced with racism and disrespect. This movie was called In the Heat of the Night, and the actor's name is Sidney Poitier. In his now famous line, "They call me Mr. Tibbs," which he utters to the Southern sheriff played by Rod Steiger, he is not just giving his name, but he's sending the relational message. They call me Mr. Tibbs. That is translated to mean you will treat me with respect. I am your equal. That was the context and relational level and the command level of that one sentence in the messaging. So when we look at an example of the difference between content and relational message levels, we have to imagine another scenario where in the beginning of class, you see me, for instance, Professor M, say, see me after class. This content level of the message means that you have been requested to meet with me after the end of the class. Now, we also have introduced the earlier part of the semester through lectures and weekly the nonverbal cues. So we can include that into this discussion, and I will at the end of this, so kind of hang tight with me here. But in the relational level of this message, we're implying something like we have the kind of relationship where I, Professor M, have the power and the authority to make a request of you, the student, and I expect you to comply with my request. Now, sometimes the impact of communication is often in the relational message being sent. For example, come back to me. How very different your response could be to that request if I were to present it kind of angry, or if I whispered it softly, or if I did a nonverbal clue and attach the nonverbal clue to that. So let's retract, start all over with this example, and you visualize this with me. So, and I've said this sometimes in class. I've said, hey, your name. Can you see me after class or wait for me after class? And I want to talk and connect with you. But you can also visualize where someone, perhaps it's a professor in the past, definitely not in this class, where the professor kind of said the tone, they used their tone to direct to you as a message level, see me after class. And you knew that with the tone or the nonverbal cue or the raise of the eyebrow, that it was not going to be a great exchange of communication in that meeting. So again, just understand that command level is super important in your messaging levels. And there is a direct contextual connection between content levels and message levels when you're delivering your interpersonal communication exchange with another person. Now, let's talk about relational bids, shall we? When we talk about relational bids and relational responses to relational bids, kind of like a tongue-tied twister, right? Let's talk about the different types. Now, since each message contains a content and a relational level, each message we send also conveys a relational bid. A relational bid is a meta message that proposes how we define the relationship and how we define self and others in that relationship. Now, there are three types of relational bids that we make in every message we send. We send a face bid, an alter casting bid, and a relationship bid. Let's start with the face bid. If you recall, in chapter 2, we discussed self-concept and identity and the connection between the influence of communication and self-concept. We also talked about the notion of face, or the social identity that a person puts forward and wants to have respected in an interaction. This also ties into our projects where at the end we wrote our constitution, how we want to appear on a professional level, how we want to appear to our family, our friends, and most importantly, how we want to appear and stay authentic to ourselves in our presence on social media. So when we're talking about face bids, this is along that lines. Again, the social identity that a person puts forward and wants to have respected in an interaction. Now, every interaction involves a face bid. This is a bid for how you want to be seen by others. Your meta message is, quote unquote, this is how I want you to see me. Now, when we talked about this in class and our project, we talked about the way we dress, the way we talk, our energy, how we communicate with one another. Some examples that I provided were that, in my professional scene, I'm not as humorous. I don't tell as many jokes as I do in class. So again, in class, I want to be seen as approachable. I want you to find education both fun and humorous. But also in another exchange, I can't be humorous when I have a client beside me and they're actually losing all their money in the stock market. That's not funny. At that point, I need to show remorse and I need to help them move their money fast, okay, into a vehicle that's going to slow down and keep up with the pace of inflation. So when we look at, again, your face bid, it is you are sending the message to someone that is relevant to the contextual situation you're finding yourself in, professionally, relationship-wise, or family-wise. Now, when we move on to alter casting bids, an alter casting bid sends a message about how you see the other person. Now, this refers as to the alter to one's ego in the original theory. However, your meta message is, this is how I see you. For example, the book gives us an example of, I need some space. You are alter casting the other as, I see you as someone who constrains me. Now, let's find a more a softer approach. Let's give another example of, I love the way you dress. I love the way you smell. I love the way you look. You're someone that I want in my space. And I want to spend time going to dinner with you and going to a concert with you. And I love to have you in my space. Again, alter casting bids is the message of how you see the other person. Now, in a student relationship, we had an example in class where one of our classmates talked about the conversation that they had with a roommate in which the relationship wasn't going as smoothly as the roommates thought it should. And that in that exchange, the bottom line was the roommate saying, hey, we like you, you're a really nice person, but we need space from you because we're not getting along in the space that we're in this dorm room. So again, that alter casting bid scenario can be compared to the example that our classmate gave us of the roommate situation. Now, let's talk about relationship bids. When we talk about relationship bids indicate how we want a relationship to be viewed. Kind of like in the beginning of our lecture when we talked about James and Rebecca, they wanted their relationship to be viewed as a story fairy tale, perfect content creator couple on social media, when in fact they were falling apart at the seams in their relationship. So when you make a relationship bid, you are implying this is how I see our relationship. And there can be more than one relationship bid in a message. So as an instructor, I may say you should be in class and on time. One relationship bid may be we have the kind of relationship where I have the authority to make such a decision in this class. An alternate bid may be we have the kind of relationship where I can remind each other of the rules of work. And still, another possibility that's in our text is that we have the kind of relationship where I can criticize your behavior. All of these bids could be accurate for this type of relationship, or none of them may be. Since a relationship has a variety of dimensions that define its innate nature, there are often multiple relationship bids that can be made. Now, as we talk about this, I want to just kind of put in here, when you understand that there are different types of relationship bids, when you combine that with what we've talked about in previous lectures, with the innate fact that we all stereotype one another in relationships, can't you see how the message can get crossed, confused, and in fact impact your ability negatively to communicate your interpersonal thoughts, ideas, and your basis for even wanting to be involved in that exchange of communication. So let's hold on to that thought as we move on to talk about the congruency of relational bids. Now, we've explained the message of the three kinds of relational bids: face bids, altercasting bids, and relationship bids. These bids define how we see ourselves in relation to others, how we see them in relation to ourselves, and how we see the important characteristics of our relationship. Now, surprisingly, there's usually a lot of congruence between these relational bids. For example, look at the statements in our book as just a way to understand this concept a little further. So, for instance, please don't make me go to bed now. The face message is you see me as old enough to stay up late. The altercasting message example of this is I see you as someone who sets the rules. The relationship message example of this message bid is we have the kind of relationship where I have to do what you say. A lot of interpretation packed into that one sentence of please don't make me go to bed now. Another example is this paper is excellent. Nice work. Now, the face message is see me as supportive of your efforts. An altercasting message can be I see you as intelligent. But the relationship message can be we have the kind of relationship where I want to support you academically. Now, I'm going to throw this in there because, we talked about this in class. If your parents are telling you that you're doing a great job in school, definitely have them reward you with like a Starbucks gift card or a Visa gift card, because remind them that you are a broke college student. All right, so you get the example of these bids and how they will show up, and they'll present themselves in certain situations. Now, let's talk about relational responses to relational bids. When we talk about the relational responses to relational bids, we have to understand the background of the fact that the relationships are not defined by the bids we make. Hang in there with me for example here. So it's just like making a bid in a poker game. This is the example in our text. We can't know if the bid is a good one until we see the response of the other player. Will she accept the bid, call or bluff, fold? In our relationships, we don't know the power of our relational bids until we know how they are acted upon. Let's give an example of another example aside from the poker game. What if you are asking someone to come and hang out with you? You don't know how they're going to respond until you look at their face. You're wondering whether they're going to accept your offer to go hang out or to go grab a bite to eat. And in the relationship, you don't know the power of your relational bid until you know how they're acted upon. So when we say an example, hey, come and hang out with me, the face message could be, hey, I like you and I want to spend time with you. The alter casting message could be, I see you as someone that maybe I'd like to hang out with and I'd like to date. The relationship message could be conceived as, hey, we have the type of relationship where I've seen you in class a couple of times, you've seen me, and it's normal for me to ask you, hey, let's go grab a bite to eat. But can't you also see where this can become a little confusing? Because some people may interpret these bids as, oh, you want to date me, marry me, you want my number, you want to like hang out with me, and you want to take me to meet your parents. When in fact, it's like, no, I just wanted to know if you wanted to come and hang out with me because you pay attention in class. I don't. You always take great notes. I should, but I don't. And I want to eventually borrow your notes so I can copy them for the exam. Ah, you see how this can become confusing in the exchange of interpersonal communication when you are analyzing bids and messaging. All right, so let's talk about the pragmatics of human communication. Our relationships are not defined by the bids we make. They're defined by the bids and the responses that we receive. Okay? So, when we go down and we understand how this plays out, the receiver has two relational response decisions to make, typically, especially in the example that I just gave. The first decision is whether to engage the bid or to avoid the bid. Should I engage you in going to hang out with you at lunch, or should I ignore your invitation to go hang out for lunch? Now, the next one is, how are you going to respond in terms of specific communication behaviors? We're seeing this prevalent a lot with people ghosting one another. They're basically avoiding the bid. They're avoiding the bid of having further communication with one another. Now, the book talks about if you answer your phone, and if you decide not to answer your phone when it's ringing, if you answer the phone, will you start singing a song, say hello, scream at the receiver, or say, who are you and why are you bothering me? Or sit silently on your end of the phone and say hello, hello. Again, while we use the phone analogy in the book, another analogy is ghosting. Okay, when we talk about the pragmatics of human communication. Now, confirmation. To be confirmed by another is to be valued as a human being. Without confirmation, we can't build healthy relationships or societies. We had a student in our class who shared with us that their friend group from high school was basically falling apart, and that two of the friends weren't really responding the way they used to in high school. This is an example, my friend. You want to be confirmed by another human as being valued. Without confirmation of them returning your phone calls in a timely manner and continuing to have the level of communication with you, then you can't build a healthy relationship. There's no way possible. So when we know what confirmation is, which in this example would be for them to maintain the same connectivity that they did in high school with you and the same conversation level, or at least respect the fact that when they say they're going to call you, they call you and they actually respect that moment and that time in communicating with you that you're accustomed to. But again, if you are not receiving that from that person, then you have to label that communication now as becoming questionably unhealthy. Is the communication unhealthy? The relationship unhealthy? Is it unhealthy on an emotional, a psychological, and even physical level? When we go back and talk about James and Rebecca, it is unhealthy on a physical level. When we talk about, hey, you're not responding to our messages and you basically got into college and you're kind of dissing us, that is an unhealthy relationship. And so recognizing that type of messaging is important. Now, when we talk about the 3 characteristics of confirming behavior, we have to put into our terms and definitions these 3 things. Number 1, recognition. Number 2, acknowledgement. And the third, endorsement. First, recognition means that you recognize the other person is there and that she has sent a bid. Recognition confirms that you exist for me. Recognition can be verbal or nonverbal. We often confirm others by seemingly subtle but intensely powerful behaviors, like making eye contact with them when they wish to engage us, or touching them when they've communicated a need for support. The next level is acknowledgement, which is usually verbal. It's a statement about awareness of or interest in the other person's perceptions, comments, or questions. For example, after hearing a person express a strong political opinion, you may acknowledge them by saying, "You seem to feel strongly on this issue." That's just acknowledging the person's exchange and they're delivering a message or a question to you. The third characteristic of confirming behavior is an endorsement. An endorsement is confirming behavior that sends the message, the way you are feeling is okay, or the way you are perceiving is okay. This is the strongest level of confirming behavior because it endorses or supports the way they are experiencing the world. Endorsement can be communicated verbally or non-verbally. Now, examples of this is when a child loses her pet. She starts crying. Her mother may pick her up, hug her, kiss her on the cheek, and say, "I know it hurts, honey. We're really going to miss your animal that just passed." But when we put all of this together in some examples that we've talked about in class and during our earlier lectures, again, recognition means that you exist for me. So an example of this could be making eye contact with the person they wish to engage, or touching them when they've communicated a need for support. A simple hello lets the other person know that we see them and welcome them into our social space. When we talk about communication, and we mentioned in early lectures, we talked about being present in the moment and putting your phone down. And we talked about the message that it sends when you're communicating with someone. You're not giving them confirmation that their message is being delivered or it's being conveyed directly to you when you have your phone in your hand and that person is in your face having a full-on conversation with you. You're not giving them the messaging that they exist, that their message is important, and that you care what they have to say. Now, when we move to the acknowledgement level in this same example, if you say, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Then what you're telling them is that you had zero awareness of any interest in their perceptions, comments, or questions because you missed the part of recognizing that they existed in front of you in an attempt exchange to communicate. And so we failed to confirm on 2 levels in this example, right? And we talked about this in class. So the third one, where we talk about endorsement, and we're confirming the behavior that sends the message, the way you're feeling is okay, and the way you're perceiving this situation that you're expressing to me is okay. A lot of times, in actuality, our conversations fall short because we will say this, but we really are not fully engaged 110% in the exchange, in the conversation with the person, and we're just hoping to catch the conversation on the next sentence. So we want to make sure that when we are in the relational responses to relational bids, and we are in this part of the interpersonal communication exchange, we are being transparent and we are giving the conversation all the attention that we can give. And we are confirming it through recognition, acknowledgement, and a true, transparent endorsement. If we were in class and I was in front of you right now, I would ask for a show of hands of how many of you have skipped over the recognition and acknowledgement because you had your phone and you wasn't fully engaged and plugged into the conversation, but you just said, wow, that's crazy. I can't believe that happened. Just hoping you could get to the next sentence to re-engage that person. So again, I encourage you, let's show up and show up intently in our conversations. So when we talk about disconfirmation, disconfirmation negates the other person as a legitimate sender. I just jumped ahead and talked about that. Three main ways that we can disconfirm someone is indifference, imperviousness, and disqualification. So understand that these are other ways that we can totally just disintegrate in a communication exchange. Let's give some examples here so that you know what it looks like when it shows up. Now, when you are in a group situation, indifference can involve a particularly cruel form of behavior. It can be cruel because the group is the audience for the disconfirmation. And it, of course, is breaking down that exchange of communication. When someone pretends like they didn't hear the question, when they ask the question and they don't have an answer for it, again, we've plugged out of the conversation. So when we talk about an example of disqualifying response, a receiver who denies that she is personally responding. Again, while these are examples that you're going to see when you're in a confrontational exchange of communication, perhaps you're having a disagreement with someone, but do know that disconfirmation occurs by accident as well because we are not fully engaged and plugged into the conversation. Okay, so let's move on and talk about expectations for involvement. I do want to go back and mention interaction context really quickly. The expectations we have for the person with whom we are communicating, for where we are communicating, and because of the communication that has come before, often color our perceptions of relational bids and responses. Now, as we discussed previously, all communication meaning is contextual. In interpreting our relational bids and responses, we need to be sensitive to how the immediate interaction context influences us. So let's talk about the expectations for involvement. We all expect people to be involved in our conversations and our exchange of communication, but there are numerous things that we could pay closer attention to when we're choosing to concentrate on each other and communicate more effectively. One is having a focused interaction. Now, of course, an unfocused interaction takes place when people just happen to be in the same place at the same time, sharing space, but not really interacting. This is also an example that we talked about in Alone Together, where the dad was always on his BlackBerry. Again, this is unfocused interaction. We're seeing this across, around the world with people being distracted by their smartphones. But while we talk about focused interaction, you have to understand that in that focused interaction, you have chosen to communicate with the other person. There's also important context within this to understand that this is the question of types of involvement that people have. The main involvement is a person's primary attention or priority at a particular point in time. For example, your main involvement could be another person or book you're reading. While your main involvement might be conversing with another person, you might also be reading the newspaper. Your newspaper engagement would be considered your side involvement. So your phone would be your side involvement. Typically what happens though, the side involvement is an activity that is not your priority, but still holds your attention to some degree. Is that focused interaction or unfocused interaction? As you're involved with the other person as you should be, again, is this under involved or unfocused? The interaction should be as you perceive it, but also how others perceive it. So let's provide an example here. If you are talking about something super important to you, and the person in front of you has a magazine or their phone in front of them, and they appear to be unfocused, that is going to place you in a category where you are labeling that bid as being an unfocused interaction. However, if they are looking at their phone or the newspaper and you're noticing or you understand that they're reading a particular article or that something in the news like that you just talked about, like a YouTube clip you may have seen on your favorite rapper, and they're getting more information and you're having that conversation, then guess what? That's a focused interaction because you both are focused on the same topic. Okay? Now, when we talk about expectations for involvement, there are 4 common culprits or sources of alienation from the interaction that could occur if you are expecting more involvement from this communication exchange and you're not talking about the same YouTube video clip that that person is playing on their phone. 4 sources are 1, preoccupation with external factors, 2, self-consciousness, 3, other consciousness, or 4, interaction consciousness. So let's explain. Reading a newspaper, talking to a third person in the interaction, and answering the phone in the middle of the conversation are all examples of external preoccupation. You allow yourself to attend to something in the situation other than the interaction. Other sources of alienation is self-consciousness, where you're concentrating more on your own performance, appearance, or behavior instead of the interaction or exchange with another person. So in this situation, you might ask, how am I doing? Or how do I look? Instead of focusing on the interaction. I'm laughing because we've had many of these examples we can think back of right now and know that when someone's like, does this dress look good on me? And you're like, dude, I just told you I didn't have enough money to go out and party with you tonight, and you're asking me, does dress look good on you? So again, totally not clued in, and that's an example of self-consciousness. Now, when we look at the consciousness, other consciousness is concentrating more on the physical presence, behaviors, or mannerisms of the other person than on the communication content. Perhaps the other is not appropriately dressed for the situation or has a facial tic or prominent rash, and you focus on these factors rather than the conversation. Another example is finally interaction consciousness, when you focus more on the flow or the method of the interaction process than on the communication content. Perhaps you and the other person seem to continuously have awkward gaps in exchange, awkwardly interrupt each other, or step on each other's comments. If you focus on your problems with turn taking rather than the content of the interaction, you're alienating from the encounter due to interaction consciousness. Now, what are the consequences of these involvement offenses? How would you feel if someone to whom you were talking to put earphones in or picked up a book you read? How would you feel if you were likely to have a conversation with your family member and then they tell you that the shirt you have on is too tight or the color doesn't look great on you? We've had this happen a lot, right? So when we are moving through this particular area of expectations for involvement, just be aware that when someone is pulling away from the conversation, you have to make a choice and a decision as to how you decide to rope them back in or bring them back in and re-engage them in the conversation while controlling your emotions, which we will talk about in another chapter. Let's talk about punctuation, and we're almost to the end. Just hang in there with me. When we talk about punctuation, is the assignment of arbitrary beginnings and endings to interaction, thus creating a communication episode that we use to interpret meaning with the episode. Similarly to using punctuation marks to segregate clauses and sentences, we punctuate interaction into meaningful units by assigning arbitrary start and finishing points, as we explain and ascribe causal sequences to events. Let's take an example from the text, then we'll take an example from our class. A classic example of a husband and wife. The husband stays out late at night and the wife waits up to tell the husband how upset she is with his behavior. The husband punctuates the communication by this: "She always nags me, so I stay out late to get away from her." The wife punctuates the communication this way: "He always stays out late, so I nag him to get him to come home." Who's right? Both are, from each person's own point of view. And that is what punctuation ultimately provides: a way of interpreting a situation that yields a point of view. This example is one of a classic wife demand, husband withdrawal pattern we will talk more about in chapter 13. So let's provide an example that's complementary of what we've discussed in class. When we are given an example of, I am staying in this relationship because it's convenient and I don't know how to break away from this person. It's just something that I've known. I've dated this person for 2 or 3 years. The other end of this punctuation is, well, this person in this relationship is all I know. I haven't dated anyone else. And so I'm staying in this relationship not because it's meaningful for me, or not because it's making me grow as a person, nor is it in contextual comparison to my personal constitution. We are just choosing to exist. One's choosing to exist because I'm comfortable in this relationship, although it's not serving me. And the other person is choosing to exist in the relationship because this is their first relationship and they don't know anything else out there exists in terms of communicative growth, individual progression through life, or even connecting to adding meaningful experiences throughout their lifespan. So when we talk about punctuating in terms of communication in the relational bids, both are right. Both are comfortable in that example in staying coupled or partnered. The other one, that's all they know in that relationship. And again, with that, we have to understand that punctuation is the assignment of arbitrary beginnings and endings to interactions that create a communication episode that we use to interpret meaning with that episode. We're staying together. Is it because we love each other? No, because it's just convenient and I don't know any better. Okay. Symmetrical and complementary patterning. Let's talk about this, and then we're going to close up our chapter. So when we talk about symmetrical and complementary patterning, we're discussing how we perceive a behavior and that it depends on the patterns of interaction we've established with the other. If you see the following pattern, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, what do you think is going to come next would be the B. Probably so. And even if the next item was a little difficult to identify, you would likely try to see it as a B because it naturally and inherently fits that pattern, right? The same is true with our relational communication. Our patterns of interaction define the dimensions of our relationships and create expectations for certain relational bids and relational responses. The idea is the centerpiece of relational communication that was proposed by theorists George Saluki and Janet Beavis. Now, relational communication theory originally focused on what was considered the critical dimensions of relationship, which was defined as establishing the right to define, direct, and delimit the actions of the dyad of the current moment. But how do we see control in action? So by looking at the 3 kinds of control behaviors and the patterns, one-up behaviors has been defined as behaviors that try to gain control of the interaction, like giving orders, changing the topic, or interrupting the other. One down behaviors are examples of behaviors that allow, seek, or accept the other's control of the situation. And one across behaviors, examples of behaviors that neither exert control nor relinquish it. Now, in communication research, the one up, one down, and one across messages have been visually displayed using directional arrows, as you can see in the book. For example, a one up message is shown using an arrow pointing up, and one down message is shown using an arrow pointing down. A one across message is shown with an arrow pointing to the side. In our book, it's illustrated as the arrow pointing to the right-hand side. Now, two patterns arise from the combination of one up and one down messaging. Symmetrical patterns occur when interactants' behaviors mirror one another, such as one up message followed by another one up message, or a one down message followed by another one down message. Equal power exists in relationships with symmetrical patterns. Typical relationships that usually fit this pattern are student to student, parent to parent, manager to manager. Now, complementary patterns occur when interaction behaviors are different from each other, such as a one up message followed by a one down, or vice versa. Typically, relationships that usually fit this pattern are teacher student, parent child, doctor patient, supervisor subordinate. Over the series of interactions, we can see the reoccurrence of rigid parents as possible indicators of relational problems. Two problematic patterns are symmetrical escalations and rigid complementary. Now, symmetrical escalation is typical of an argument which each person continually tries to one up the other. Rigid complementarity occurs when people are stuck in static roles. In relationships, rigid complementary often leads to dissatisfaction and long-term disconfirmation. All too common example of symmetric escalation can be found in road rage situations. As road rage experts know, a person faced with an escalating situation needs to be able to send a one down message to relinquish control and begin the de-escalation. Now, let me give you an example of, since we do live in Philadelphia, I want to give you an example of how road rage could actually be dealt with. Ignore them. We're in Philly. Philly is a different beast. It's a different contextual environment. And I have had many people just road rage all around me. But I have chosen to ignore it and not feed into it. So just wanted to put that in there as, you know, a lot of people get upset and they up one. They go up one on the conversation and the exchange. Do not escalate. You want to make sure that you are diffusing it as quickly as possible. So when we're looking at symmetrical and complementary patterning, the theory is beautiful. But when you are in a conversation with someone, or you're in a meeting in a professional setting, I want to encourage you to take this symmetrical patterning, and before you respond, say, give me a moment to get back with you. Let me take a break here and review my notes. If you engage in patterning the conversation, then you can respond with a more thought-filled response that can complement the exchange and eliminate and de-escalate any potential power issues that you may see coming through in that communication. So, with that said, we have completed the discussion of the relational context of interpersonal communication. I thank you for your time and your attention for listening to this lecture, and we will continue to delve more into this wonderful breadth of information in class. Have a wonderful day.